Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have a lot to cover, so we are going to get started right away. Thank you all for coming. Today's webinar is toward the development of equity indicators for California. I'm Heather Huff, the Executive Director of PACE. In 2019, Chris Edley led a committee for the National Academy of Sciences with the goal of developing a framework for how we as a country can measure issues of equity and access in education. As I think we all know, the context has changed a lot since 2019, but the need for good indicators of educational equity has not. I know that no matter where we sit in our lives, both personal and professional, we've been consumed by this crisis that we are currently in the midst of. And so I'm extra appreciative that you've all joined us today, because when students come back to school, whether that's in the fall or later or this spring, they are going to have very heightened levels of need. And we're going to need now more than ever a good way of understanding how they're doing and what types of access and opportunity gaps we have both introduced and exacerbated as a result of this crisis. So that's exactly why we need to now dig into this issue of how we can better measure and report equity and how we can start to develop a much clearer indicator system so that we're all on the same page about educational equity in California and how to hold ourselves accountable to these ideals. So I want to talk for a second about today's agenda. Or today's panelists. So you know me, I'm Heather Huff. We have Chris Edley Jr., who is with the Berkeley School of Law, Sean Reardon with Stanford University, and Michal Kurlaender at the University of California at Davis. And today's agenda is that first, Chris will start us off with an overview of the NRC report on educational indicators, which is the framework for today's conversation. And then we'll go into examples of recent research that flesh out these indicators. Sean Reardon will talk about research coming out of the Educational Opportunity Project at Stanford University. Michal Kurlaender will talk about research coming out of the California Education Lab at UC Davis. And I will give a whirlwind tour of how some recent PACE and Getting Down to Facts 2 research also fits into this indicator system. Then Chris Edley will give us some discussion and recommendation and next steps, and we will open it up to ample time for question and answer. So before I hand it off to Chris, just a couple of logistical notes. We would like for everyone to post any questions and comments into the Q&A box. This is so that we can keep track of them in one place and other attendees can also see them. You can also vote on other people's questions, which raises them to the top and they'll be the first to get answered. Also a heads up that slides and links to ample resources can be found on the PACE event page. And we will also post here in the webinar, as Sean is doing right now in the chat box, links to this event page and resources so you can access them directly. And then finally, the video recording from this webinar will be posted online early next week, and we'll email everybody with that when it's ready. So without any further ado, I would like to hand it over to Chris. Chris, we can't hear you if you're speaking.
That. It says
yep, we can hear you now.
Okay. Thanks to everyone for coming. I want to start by just giving you a little bit of the lay of the land. I think everybody is probably familiar with the NRC as a component of the National Academy of Science and the way in which it does consensus panel reports. We worked for almost 2 years. I think if you follow the URL to the full report, it's posted on the PACE website. You'll see the membership, and it was quite a terrific group in terms of expertise and long concern with this set of issues. Our charge was simply to work on the design of a national system of educational indicators. We weren't told as a committee what equity means or what national system means. And I think that we spent a lot of time thinking about this in a way that would make sense for the broadest possible set of audiences. So your slide now, the indicator system shows some of the 8 desiderata. These are, to a certain extent, aspirational in that it's kind of difficult to imagine a system that would achieve all of these. I think the number one, the multiple dimensions, looking at both outcomes and opportunities, we thought was critical. We focused on the issue of disparities, subgroup disparities, but particularly those disparities that are really salient for policy purposes, meaning that not just the research literature, but in a sense, the policy debates over the years have involved these indicators or these domains, and that the domains were going to illuminate issues that could be addressed by policy, in our view, at least. The third one is very difficult. The comparability, of course, across jurisdictions, given the differences in data systems and so forth, as well as the scalability. Both, I think, will require a lot of hard work, jurisdiction-specific work, indeed. Appropriate to grade level. Number 5 is very important because we think of opportunities as including things about the context and the structural characteristics in which students find themselves. In particular, we focused on segregation and concentrated poverty. Number 7, as an NRC exercise, the emphasis really was very much on making sure that the research literature supported not just the domains we were picking, but the constructs as well. There are additional issues that we cover in our recommendation where it didn't seem to us there was a research consensus on how to measure certain variables, and those we simply point to the need for further work. Next slide, Jeannie. I don't have control. Okay, so speaking of domains, here are 3. Kindergarten, K-12, learning and engagement, educational attainment. For each domain, there's 7 of them, we have indicators. And here you have on the side particulars on what the indicators are that are associated with each of those domains. So for example, in educational attainment, we talk about disparities in on-time graduation as being an indicator. There's a deeper level of detail that we discuss a little bit in the report, but really is mostly for further work. And that is a level of detail that goes beyond the construct, which are numbered here, to actually look at the specific variables, how they're defined, what data sets would be mobilized in order to inform an actual indicator system. Again, that will require consensus building, as well as really a technical screen to see what is doable. Next screen, Jeannie. Well, those were the outcome domains. Here are the opportunity or input domains. You can see that in all of the cases on both the opportunity side and the outcome side, we are focused on disparities, in subgroup disparities. That's the way we think about equity. It's not just, and in all cases, we've tried to avoid the error of thinking about it in terms of disparities in being above some cut score or some goal, and instead just looking at the gap between the population subgroups on the theory that even if excellence in the aggregate was not being achieved, the equity issue is not about the excellence so much as it about the disparities of what kids are getting and what they're able to do with that. Next screen. So here's the whole pie chart. all the domains, 7 of them. We've labeled them A through G because there was a significant California contingent on the group. Just drilling down, next slide, on K-12, you can see the indicators, 3, 4, 5 on the left. And for each indicator, the particular constructs. And then, as I was suggesting, the third column would be the specific variables and data sets that would be mobilized. Next screen. Similarly here, if we just focus on curriculum and instruction, you have indicators 10 through 13. Next slide, Jeannie. And here's what that looks like if we drill down. One thing that you should notice is that in most cases, perhaps the great majority of cases, the constructs that we've chosen are admittedly proxies for something else that is difficult to observe or for which variables have not been achieved. We don't have a direct measure of effective teaching. So as proxies, we have experience, certification, diversity. Let me wrap it up there and turn it over to Sean. You will have the slides so you can dig into it in more depth, as well as the full report. Again, thanks for participating. Sean.
Sean, we can't hear you yet.
Can you hear me now? There you are.
Yes.
Hi everyone. Thanks for being here, and thanks Heather for convening us, and Chris for the introduction to the work of the NRC panel. What I wanted to describe today was just some of the evidence we have about a few of the indicators in California, particularly around academic achievement and segregation. These data I'm going to show you come out of work we've been doing at the Educational Opportunity Project at Stanford, and you can see lots more of this work at our website, which is edopportunity.org, which is in the chat box as well. So the first indicator I want to look at is kindergarten readiness, and in particular readiness in terms of academic skills. So using data from the Early Childhood Longitudinal Survey, we're able to look at the average patterns of school readiness of children in low income and middle income and high income communities across the country, as well as in California specifically. And that's what this figure is showing you. The horizontal axis on these figures is a measure of the socioeconomic status or relative affluence of communities. The vertical axis is a measure of kindergarten readiness in terms of pre-literacy skills and, on the left, or pre-numeracy and math skills on the right. The yellow dots represent school districts in California that are represented in the national study, and the sort of hard to see faint circles behind are the districts all over the country. And what you can see is that the red line, which indicates the average pattern nationally, and the yellow line, which indicates the average pattern in the United States, aren't the same, particularly for lower income school districts. So low income school districts, the students in those districts come to kindergarten less ready than their peers in similar communities around the country. That's not true for students in upper income communities in California, where students in those communities come to school with higher levels of school readiness overall, but also levels that are comparable to similar places around the country. So what that tells us is that in California, we have a school readiness problem that's particularly pronounced among low-income communities, even more so than it is in the rest of the country. The next figure here is a picture of academic performance during grades 3 through 8. So this relates to the indicator 5, the disparities in performance on tests. And here we're looking at disparities between low-income school districts and higher-income school districts. But now we're looking at 3rd through 8th grade test scores. And the figure is similar to the prior one. In the more affluent communities in California, average performance is similar to affluent communities around the country. But in the poor districts in California, average performance is lower on average than most poor districts around the country. And there's a huge gap in performance between students in low-income communities and higher-income communities. So an indicator like this tells us something both about the relative performance of students in low and high-income districts, but also about the relative performance of students in California to those in similar districts around the country. And we're able to do that because we can make the California tests comparable to tests in other states. If we then look at disparities by race and ethnicity, this picture is showing us the average 3rd grade performance of white students compared to the average 3rd grade performance of Hispanic students who are in the same district. So each dot in this picture is a school district. The yellow ones are California districts and the gray ones are districts around the rest of the country. The horizontal axis is the average 3rd grade performance of white students, and the vertical axis is the average 3rd grade performance of Hispanic students. And that diagonal line represents the line at which white and Hispanic students have the same average performance. And you can see that for virtually every district in the country and every district in California as well, the average performance of Hispanic students is below the average performance of white students in 3rd grade. This is on a combination of math and reading tests combined. And in many cases, the difference is quite large, 2 to 3, even 4 grade levels in some places. So we have very large performance gaps in California, even larger in many cases than the rest of the country. If we look at the same picture for 8th grade, you can see that by 8th grade, the picture is relatively similar. We still have very large achievement gaps. So those achievement gaps aren't narrowing much from 3rd to 8th grade. Another way to look at this is to look at how fast students learn from 3rd to 8th grade. So here, the horizontal axis is the average learning rate for white students, and the vertical axis is the average learning rate for Hispanic students. If the learning rate is 1, that means the average student in a district learns the equivalent of 1 grade level each year. So that's by definition sort of the average learning rate. And you can see that in many districts in California, the learning rates of white and Hispanic students are relatively similar. That is, they fall along the 45-degree line there, the diagonal line. And in a number of districts, the learning rates for Hispanic students are actually faster than the learning rates for white students. Los Angeles, for example, which is the large yellow dot to the lower left there, learning rates are similar for white and Hispanic students. In both cases, they're slightly below the national average, but they're similarly below. On the other hand, if you look at the districts in the upper right quadrant, in some of those places, learning rates are equally high for white and Hispanic students. So by being able to construct measures of not just test scores, but of learning rates, and then to construct those separately by subgroups, we can look at disparities in test scores and disparities in learning rates separately in different states and in different school districts and even in different schools across the country. The final picture I want to show you is an indicator of one of our opportunity measures, that is the extent of racial, ethnic, and economic segregation in communities. And so what we have in this picture on the horizontal axis is a measure of segregation, and it's a measure that represents the extent to which Hispanic students in a school district attend higher poverty schools than white students in the same district. So if that measure is 0, that means white and Hispanic students attend schools with equal proportions of low-income classmates. If the measure is 0.4, as it is for Los Angeles, the big yellow dot there, that means that the average Hispanic student in Los Angeles attends a school that has 40 percentage points more free and reduced price lunch eligible students than the average white students in Los Angeles. So that's a high degree of ethnic economic segregation. And you can see here we have the data for every school district in California shown in yellow, and districts for the rest of the country in sort of gray behind that. And the pattern here suggests, first of all, that there's very high levels of segregation in some school districts, like Los Angeles, for example, and relatively low levels in other districts. And that the size of the achievement gap, which is what's represented on the vertical axis, is much larger in the most segregated districts than it is in the least segregated districts. So that tells us that segregation is related to educational opportunities in important ways. And so this measure of segregation then becomes one of the indicators that we included in the NRC report. I'm going to end there. So we've shown you measures of academic achievement and disparities, as well as measures of segregation. And I'll turn it over now to Michal to talk about indicators of college and career readiness.
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to talk about work that our lab, in conjunction with PACE and really in partnership with the California Department of Education, has been doing to understand equity in college and career readiness, and in alignment between K-12 and higher education in the state. And most of what I'll be talking about today is in work that we have either already or recently put out through PACE, and new work that will be coming out through PACE. So the first thing that, the first report I'd like to draw your attention to is work we're doing to understand course taking patterns. Again, an important indicator of access to quality instruction and content that our students have. And in particular, we're focused on math here and 12th grade course taking, partly in response to understand what students are taking in 12th grade, also in response to policies or suggestions of additional requirements for students to improve college readiness by taking 12th grade math. So in this work, we have actually looked at course taking information collected through the California Department of Ed on CalPads. That would include not transcript level, but every course level by student. Here we're just focused on 12th grade. And what we did was we broke out different types of math pathways. And here this is just 12th grade, so just math levels. What are students taking in 12th grade for the 3 cohorts for which we have detailed information about their course taking patterns. And we group these in the report. We give lots of explanation for why and how we group these. But importantly, we're going to focus on students who have access to advanced levels of math, whether it be AP math or other advanced math that requires at least Algebra 2 or higher. Also pay attention to the yellow bar, which, or the yellow category, which is no math, in response to the idea that students should be taking 4 years of math for college readiness. So you'll see about a quarter students did not take math. A quarter of 12th graders in California did not take math. Actually, 60% of those students took Algebra 2 or higher in their 11th grade year. Importantly for this conversation, we're interested in disparities in math course taking by both race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic disadvantage status. So here I draw your attention to both the disparities we see in AP math course taking behavior, but also into what we might consider as lower levels of math, engagement in 12th grade, in particular students who are taking below Algebra 2 as 12th graders. And we'll see big disparities in those by racial ethnic groups. We see these disparities if we use socioeconomic disadvantage, and in the report, we further disaggregate both by race and SED and several other categories. Finally, in the report, we also look at this at the school level. We're interested in course taking patterns across schools with, as was previously discussed, the importance of concentrations of poverty here. This is just deciles of % of students who are classified as socioeconomic disadvantage. And again, I draw your attention not just to the advanced and AP math, but also to the differences in the % of students who are taking below Algebra 2 as 12th graders. Importantly, given the proposed policies to increase math taking in 12th grade, we do observe that most schools have most of their students enrolled in math in 12th grade with some disparities, and we discuss that in detail in the report. Turning our attention to other metrics, California launched its college and career readiness indicator as a form of state accountability for college and career readiness. In this report, just recently released a couple months ago, we look at how students fare on that indicator across the state, but we also complement that with qualitative interviews with district and county superintendents to understand how they're thinking about college readiness in the kind of more complicated set of options that students have to improve their college readiness. Oops, apologize, just a second. This is the broad CCI indicator of preparedness. Just again to remind you, and this is detailed in the report, the CCI is a school level accountability measure indicating how well high schools are preparing students for success in graduation. That includes college and or career readiness. And individual students are deemed prepared or approaching prepared or not prepared based on 8 indicators. And so here we see the prepared and approaching prepared levels by key subgroups, race, SED, and English learners. In the report, we detailed those 8 indicators, again, looking at disparities across each of those indicators that are all detailed here. I'm gonna focus on just a few of them. This is a performance on the Smarter Balance assessments in 11th grade. So again, this shows students by these status, neither standard met in English or math, standard met in math only, a very small number of students, standard met in ELA only, and standard met in both. Again, we see these statistics released through the Department of Ed in other ways. Importantly, this is just one of the indicators and one that we, again, given the report we know continues to be an important one, performance on our state assessments. Another one we look at is completing A to G coursework by subgroups. Importantly, to be prepared on the CCI, A to G alone is not sufficient. You would have to have A to G plus one of the other indicators, and that's because so many of our students who just met A to G eligibility were still deemed unprepared or in need of developmental coursework once they got to college. And so the CCI includes A to G, but in addition to an additional indicator. Finally, the last another indicator that we think is important is access to rigorous coursework, whether that be through advanced placement or through dual enrollment opportunities. In a recent report released by PACE and Wheelhouse, the Center for Community College Leadership and Research, also at UC Davis, we look at students' access to dual enrollment courses. In particular, we do an unprecedented match between every California high school student and California community colleges to look at rates of student participation, high school students' participation at community colleges, and find that participation among California high school students at community colleges while they're still enrolled in high school is quite higher than we previously believed. In fact, 12.6% of California high school students took a community college course at some point, whether that be through formal dual enrollment programs or informal individual course taking on their own or through support of their school district. Importantly, we again see disparities by race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic disadvantage in those in participation in this important pathway. We also look at this at by schools, and here we actually find that many schools have none of their students participating in dual enrollment opportunities, while some schools have much greater participation. And in future work, we're trying to unpack where that is. The state has made huge efforts to increase dual enrollment participation and partnerships between K-12 schools and community colleges. And so we anticipate in future reports and more recent cohorts, we will be able to observe that. I will turn it over to Heather.
Great, thank you so much, Michal and Sean. And we have some questions, keep them coming in the Q&A, and we'll raise them up in a second. So I'm going to do a very quick tour of some other recent PACE and Getting Down to Facts research and how it fits into this equity indicator system. And part of the reason for this is both to give you links to other research that you can dig into, but also to provide a little bit of a proof of concept. I know that data availability is something that many of us know is a weakness in California, but it doesn't mean that we don't have lots of data available to bring to bear to answer these kinds of questions. So I am going to, sorry. Okay, so very quickly, I'm going to go over a couple of key findings, and it's going to be whirlwind, so please click on the links if you want more. So first, we know that student engagement in school is an important equity indicator, and that student attendance is the first piece of authentic engagement. Kevin G. recently did some research on chronic absenteeism that shows really different levels of chronic absenteeism by student demographic group. As you can see here, 30% of schools are in the lowest category. This is red on the dashboard for their African-American students, compared to only 12% of schools in the lowest category overall. Next, we see that high school graduation is a key element of educational attainment. And Russ Rumberger and Cameron Sublett did some research showing how these rates vary by subgroup. So as you can see here, 94% of Asian American students graduated high school in 2017, compared to only 73% of African American students. So highlighting that difference there. Switching to early childhood, we also know that there are big differences in who has access to high quality early childhood education. This figure, which was in recent research by Deborah Stipek, shows this variation by region. In some places like Riverside County, down here at the bottom, licensed care is available for only 13 to 19% of young children who have working parents. And when students are in K-12, they have varied access to qualified teachers. Getting down to facts research by the Learning Policy Institute showed that 65% of principals in schools that serve a high proportion of students of color report that classrooms are staffed by underqualified teachers, compared to only 48% in schools with a low proportion of students of color. And research by George Farkas has shown that low-performing African-American students are actually less likely than low-performing white students to be identified for special education services, giving them less access to the kinds of supports they might need to thrive. Case research in the core districts also has found that even within the same school, African-American students report a negative school climate compared to their peers, meaning that they feel less safe and have a lower sense of belonging and connectedness. And finally, Randall Rebeck's Getting Down to Facts 2 research showed that elementary schools that serve a high proportion of students in poverty have fewer mental health supports for students. So I know that was very quick, but I just wanted to give you a sense of the landscape and to provide some of those links. I also want to echo what Chris had said earlier, which is that how you get from knowing that there are gaps to operationalizing those indicators into things that can be used locally to understand differences in schools and districts across the state is a really important next step. So with that, I will hand it over to Chris to wrap us up. Chris?
There we go. Okay.
We don't see you yet.
Thanks, Heather, and you don't see me. There's not much to look at.
There you are.
Okay. Thanks to my other panelists. Let me just say a couple of things in terms of next steps. First of all, I think the committee was in a place where we concluded that in the sense of a national system of indicators, we didn't mean a federal system, that simply seems a bridge too far, and that it was more analogous in our ideal world to Common Core state standards. That is to say, a strong alignment of what various jurisdictions were doing. Number two, that next stage of work in which we try to operationalize it needs to proceed in each state and indeed often at the district level. And that means assembling, the way I think about it is a large room in which there are a series of tables. Now, in order to build consensus on how to make this operational, we need researchers at one table. We need various advocates and other interest groups at another table. We need local and state education officials, especially at the district level, at another table. And we need technical experts on data systems and so forth at still another table. I've probably left somebody out. But at the end of the day, we have to draw from all of those perspectives and try to achieve some consensus that will be supported by research, politically sustainable, fiscally feasible, and most of all, useful to as many sub-audiences as possible. The last thing I'd say by way of next steps is that one of the things we tried very hard to do on a committee, and that will remain important at the state level, is a so-called principle of parsimony. It's a lot easier to draw up an indicator system with 75 variables in it than it is to pick a dozen or 15. Yet for our purposes to bring, in our judgment, for purposes of bringing general attention to the equity issues and for impelling action in a policy and administrative sense, fewer was going to be better than extensive. That's not to say that on a base level of indicators, one couldn't build additional variables, additional indicators of particular interest to, say, researchers or the superintendent of a specific district or to advocates. So the system needs to be flexible, but with a core, if you will, of indicators around which there's a strong consensus, certainly within a state and ideally over time, nationwide. I guess I had one more point, and that is there's a lot of important stuff that needs additional research in order to be integrated into the system. I think a great example of that is the question of whether or not schools and other child-serving institutions are doing what they should do to provide supportive services, non-academic supportive services that will help students overcome the adversity that they face, the effects on learning of adverse childhood experiences. We need measures of what those supports need to. Well, we need consensus on what those supports should be, and we need measures of whether or not there is adequate access and uptake for those services. That's the research agenda that needs, in my judgment, urgent attention. Heather, let me stop there and turn it over to you to moderate the Q&A.
Great. I am coming back online now, and I'd like to ask all of the other panelists to come back on video as well. Okay, so what we're going to do now is to raise up some of the questions that have been put into the Q&A box. And Chris, if you can come back on video for this, that would be great. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to start with a question that has come up in several different ways in the Q&A box, which is for folks to talk about what we know about how districts can close these both outcomes and opportunity gaps. So Sean, you posted a link to the LPI report that you and that team had done a while back, looking at some of the outlier schools. But what do we know about places that look different on some of these indicators, and what are they doing to close those gaps? Sean, you're muted.
Sorry, still trying to learn Zoom etiquette here. So in the LPI report that I posted the link to, we looked at districts in California that had sort of better performance of both their minority and their white students relative to what we would predict based on socioeconomic status. And we found that one of the best predictors of that had to do with teachers, so teacher certification and to some extent teacher experience. So places that had fewer teachers with provisional certification and teachers with more experience look like they're doing better. So obviously, sometimes it's not always possible to find and recruit the most experienced teachers or certified teachers, but to the extent one can, that seems at least correlated with better equity. The other thing we found very consistently in our research is that segregation really matters. So net of everything else we can measure about school districts, the school districts that are less segregated have smaller achievement gaps, and those achievement gaps grow less or even narrow while kids are in school than in highly segregated school districts. So to the extent school districts have some capacity to think about student assignment systems and to create less segregated systems, that seems to be associated with reductions in disparities.
Michal or Chris, anything you'd like to add to that question? Okay, great. So one of the next questions that has come up again in several different ways is about operationalizing these kinds of indicators for California. So are there conversations about creating an indicator system like this for California? And, or what are some of your ideas about how we could get there? Chris, let's start with you.
I'd say the conversations are nascent. We will certainly reach out to all of you who have registered for this webinar to update you as that proceeds. We're especially interested in soliciting assistance in this consensus building process. And indeed, in most districts, we'll have to identify folks who can get down in the weeds about what is technically possible on district data systems and the state data systems and the like. Frankly, we need some money from funders in order to do what needs to be done. That's a familiar cry of pain from all of us. But we think we have a reasonably well-defined project for that, and hope to involve many of you in doing it. We've already had expressions of interest from several districts and from several researchers and from several organizations like the California School Boards Association who want to be a part of this. And PACE, of course, will be a key leader in the effort, so stay tuned. We're going to do it. I mean, I should say that this, if we're talking about a common core, by analogy, there've got to be some early adopter states, some path breaker states, if you will, and California should be one of them.
Absolutely. So there were also some questions about trying to understand what's under the hood. So for example, Michal, one of the questions that came up was going beyond what we can see from the quantitative data. What do we know about student engagement, authentic student learning in college? And I know this is something that you've thought a lot about. How do you and your team think about getting even richer information in order to bring that to the conversation?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. I think in this newer report we did, I mean, we heard, for example, from superintendents who made this equity piece be a signature part of any conversation about course scheduling, looking at disparities in AP participation, for example, and in dual enrollment, right? So what, ensuring that the distribution of across race and ethnicity in terms of who's taking what courses is a key feature of how they do their course planning. So among the district leaders that make this a big piece of how they approach counseling students in an increasingly very complex kind of space around what courses students should take. Is dual enrollment better than AP? What, so the set of options that students have, pathways in math, for example, is for students who, to what type of math course to take. We're seeing much increases in, for example, participation in AP statistics over calculus pathways, right? And so all these sets of equity ends up being a key piece of this. Then we heard from school districts that they're part of that conversation. In terms of the larger conversation, if you're thinking about sort of access to rigorous courses, for example, it's really important to consider what we know about why those matter, right? It's not just a signal for college admissions, right? It's that we believe that behind that is access to sort of better instruction, often more prepared teachers, a set of peers, right? So behind this idea of the signal of sort of more advanced courses are a whole set of forces that shape why we think access to particular type of courses lead to the better outcomes students experience in college. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about why those matter and how we lack data to really unpack those components. And so to the extent that we have them available and can probe them at least qualitatively, we try to do that. But I definitely recognize that a lot of the mechanisms behind those courses and the proxy for kind of college readiness courses are actually missing from our data system. And until they're not missing, it's really hard to really translate sort of why they're so important for our students.
Thank you so much. Anything, Sean or Chris, that you'd like to add to that? Okay, Chris, I have a question directly for you. And you and Sean might be able to contribute to this based on your experience building this indicator system. So you mentioned that the need for consensus around non-academic services and how we measure different indicator pieces is really important. But what's your current thinking on how you build that consensus, especially across really diverse sets of stakeholders with lots of different ways that you could measure educational equity? And do you have any lessons to learn just from the consensus process of the NRC, where I'm sure there were some disagreements as well?
Well, yes, I do, from the NRC process, but also several years ago, I chaired the National Commission on Educational Equity and Excellence. It was a diverse group of leaders, and we ended up with a unanimous report after 2 years of deliberation on a path forward. In both cases, the touchstone has to be the research, has to be the evidence. When people have opposing points of view that may be based on intuition, that may be based on the politics of the issue, I think people going into the whole process have to agree that research evidence trumps subjective views about what is good and what is bad. So that really has to be at the fore. I think that's a reason, for example, that we did not in the NRC report go into detail about how effective teaching should be measured, or what kinds of supportive services should be used to address adverse childhood experiences. The research doesn't give us a solid enough basis, a solid enough research consensus to really inform that decision-making. And Lord knows we need more research-informed decision-making.
Right. Michal, I'm going to pose this question for you. There is interest in understanding how the governor's P20 data system aligns with some of this thinking. And I'm on that committee as well, so I can pipe in. But Michal, do you want to take a stab at addressing that, what the current thinking is?
Sure, and I'm also part of the sort of the research subgroup in that as well. And I mean, I think here's where we see a key piece. At least I'll speak just from the high school to post-secondary system space. There's been such an important need to understand what both aspects of what students experience in high school, how they translate to their experience in college. But there's also in our state where we have such high enrollment and participation across multiple segments of our system, and a really important need to be able to track students' pathways within and between our post-secondary systems, between community colleges, CSUs, and UCs. And part of the desire to really look closely at dual enrollment, for example, and transfer pathways for community colleges is because we know students would be able to advance towards their post-secondary goals more efficiently if we didn't necessarily have different standards for articulation. Different courses mean different things across our system. And so the research we need is also to illuminate all of these spaces where we know students both are lacking information about the best pathways, but also where we can hopefully improve and smooth out those pathways for students to increase their post-secondary goals. So I'll give you a concrete example. As students take courses in high school, can we learn about whether, while they're at community college or through advanced placement, can we learn about whether those courses improve their time to degree, which is one of the indicators, right? And can we learn about whether community college courses taken could serve as better pathways towards BAs, both for CSU and UC and credit attainment. Done a lot of work to think about developmental ed coursework in that way. Can we use information? Currently, community colleges rely on students to bring the information from high school about what they've done in terms of preparation to place out of particular courses. Shouldn't we have a data system that allows that? That onus should not be on students, right? Our state should be able to provide that in a way for students to and for institutions to have the information necessary to advise students about their best pathways. So I'll say that, and I think those are all the topics that work group is taking up.
And the one thing that I'll add is that I think what Chris presented here today and the pieces that we've tried to flesh out are aspirational, and we are a pretty far way from having the ability to flesh all of those things out for every school and every district in California at this time. The emphasis that we've been taking in the data work is to both have that aspiration in mind, but also not to get bogged down by it in the short term, because there's a whole lot that we can do better with data that we already have collected. So let's make sure we do that, but at the same time be working toward this aspirational data goal. Sean, this next question is for you. A couple of folks have indicated that we were a little bit heavy on secondary and transitions to college work in this presentation. Can you talk a little bit both about what you measured and what's the underlying data for your early grades representations in kindergarten and through elementary school, but also any of the thinking you've done about what other types of information we could gather on student learning and the student experience in the elementary grades?
Sure. The data we used for kindergarten readiness comes from a national study called the Early Childhood Longitudinal Study, which was conducted by NCES. And that study assessed kindergarten students in about 1,000 kindergartens around the country. And they had a one-on-one assessment with a trained assessor who sat down with each student individually and assessed their pre-numeracy skills, their pre-literacy skills. And they assessed them in Spanish if their home language was Spanish, or in English if their home language was in English. So it's a pretty high quality assessment and gives us a pretty good portrait of national patterns, but also for bigger states, it gives us some portrait of patterns in each state, like California. Unfortunately, most states don't have systematic kindergarten readiness assessment systems. And so it's hard to do that kind of analysis on an annual basis in each school or school district in a state or across the country. And so until we have more standardized systems of kindergarten readiness assessments, it's going to be hard to do socio-emotional readiness assessments in a standardized way or academic readiness assessments in a standardized way. So the best we could do was from this national study sampling 1,000 schools. For grades 3 through 8, we have standardized tests that all states give as part of ESSA. And we take those state assessments from every state and put them onto a common national scale. And that makes it possible to compare them across states, but also across time and so on. So we have pretty good measures of academic performance in 3 through 8, but we don't have good measures of other kinds of comparable measures of kind of academic performance or disparities in the elementary years, because things like GPA, for example, are not collected or assessed in some comparable way across places. Some of the measures of environment and opportunity, we don't have either good consensus on what those measures should be or good measures of those things. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done to think about, both to come to consensus about what kinds of opportunities we should be measuring in the elementary grades, and then how to best develop a system that collects that information in a kind of a timely, regular, comparable way that would allow us to monitor that. So we're not there yet, but we have some start.
If I can just briefly add a thought, Heather. I think many people, probably most careful observers, would have a lot of doubts about using standardized testing as the measure of academic attainment. They're advocates for portfolio measures, for performance measures, and so forth. But there are two difficulties. One, as Sean was suggesting about climate, consensus on how best to measure those kinds of assessments and make them comparable. But secondly, I'd point out that if we're focusing on subgroup disparities as our measure of equity, rather than on instructional decisions about a specific student, then the picture's a little bit different. It's not that we need a comprehensive view of the student. It's that we need to take one or more variables that we know are supported by research that have meaning in practice and in policy, and see what the differences are, the subgroup differences are, full stop. And so it's a partial look at what we might think of as attainment or of opportunities. But as Heather, you were suggesting before, this is a world in which we have to start with the partial and try to move towards the complete. And that'll be easier in some areas. In some areas, that's just about research investment of dollars. But in other areas, it's a bigger lift.
And I'm glad that you mentioned.
Let me add one more thing to that. So I think that Chris is right, and people often sort of think we shouldn't spend so much time focused on test scores, which I would agree with, because they're at best a very limited measure of the kinds of schooling outcomes we want or the developmental goals we have for children. And that's certainly all true, but nonetheless, I think they serve as a very reliable indicator of when there's inequity in the system. If you have a school system where minority students are scoring an average of 2 or 3 grade levels behind white students on standardized tests, that's a big canary in the coal mine that tells you kids aren't getting the same educational opportunities in that place. That doesn't mean that's the only thing we care about. In the same way that the monthly jobs report isn't the only thing we care about in the economy. But when the job report looks bad, that tells us there's a lot of things wrong with the economy. And so I think it's useful to think of these indicators as sort of proxies for the opportunity structure, not measures of everything we care about for individual children's development. And in that sense, they work, I think, quite well.
It's sort of a systemic indicator or diagnosis. The other thing, though, in terms of the parsimony is I find a useful metaphor in hospitals. It's sort of you're building your ideal hospital. What do you want the emergency room to be able to do? There's lots of other stuff going on in the rest of the hospital, lots of other competencies sprinkled around in the rest of the hospital. But if we're just trying to get a snapshot of how that community is served, looking at the emergency room may be a decent indicator. I'm most concerned about early childhood, frankly, the daycare measures and the like. You may have noted that we use access and enrollment in licensed childcare when we know that so many people are in the informal sector rather than the licensed sector, and we know that a lot of good learning goes on in the informal sector, but we simply don't have the wherewithal to capture that, to measure it. So we've used this licensed variable as the best we can do for now.
Well, thank you both so much. And with just a few seconds left, I'm going to just put in one plug for something that came up a couple of times in the comments, which is that as we're talking about measuring educational equity, we also have to talk about dollars. Chris, you tipped your hat to this. Doing things differently, serving students differently costs money. And we know that our systems are not well funded here in California, and that even within the state we have inequitable distribution of funds, often by region. So just one thing to note as we close up. So Michal, Chris, Sean, thank you so much to all of our attendees. Thank you so much for spending your lunch hour with us, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. Stay well and safe, everyone.
Thanks, Al.